This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. A milestone is expected soon in Connecticut's recreational cannabis industry. The state is expected to select its first retail licenses by lottery, but there are thousands of applicants for just a dozen licenses in this first round. Coming up, we hear from Andrea Comer, Deputy Commissioner of the State Department of Consumer Protection and Chair of the Social Equity Council. We also talk with Hearst, Connecticut's Julia Bergman about other cannabis developments. First, the Republican and Democratic state conventions wrapped up this weekend, and there are some notable races shaping up for primary day. For U.S. Senate, state Republicans endorsed social moderate Themis Claridis in a matchup against potential matchup, against incumbent Senator Richard Blumenthal. Meanwhile, Democrats have endorsed a diverse pool of candidates in several state races. Today, Where We Live, the Connecticut Mirror's Mark Pazniokas joins us to talk about what lies ahead for election season. Now, what races will you be watching? You can join us too, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WMPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. Joining us first on Zoom, Mark Pazniokas, Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. Mark, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Lucy.
Now, you're going to give us a recap of the conventions, including several state constitutional office races. But let's get some of these congressional seats out of the way, including the Senate race I just referenced, Themis Claridis. For many people remember her as the House Minority Leader. And tell us what happened at the convention with the delegates and this endorsement.
So Themis Claridis went to the convention knowing she was going to win the endorsement. The question would be by what margin? She was hoping to really get as much as 70% or so. But she was the target of sort of a whispering campaign, some anonymous text messages and emails that pointed out she was less than loyal to Donald Trump, which can really hurt you in a Republican setting, even in Connecticut. And it also talked about her record on gun control. She did vote for the Sandy Hook gun control law that was passed when she was in the legislature. She's also a supporter of abortion rights and gay marriage. So that puts her out of the mainstream as far as the activists who tend to be selected as delegates. Whether that puts her out of the mainstream as far as Republican voters, we'll find that out in August when she goes up against two more conservative candidates who are absolutely loyal to Donald Trump.
Tell us about those two candidates for a potential matchup in August.
Unlike Themis Claridis, neither one of them has ever won an election for public office. So one of them is Leora Levy. She is a Republican National Committee member from Greenwich. Her biggest claim to fame is she is a rainmaker for the party. She knows lots of rich folks who will write checks to different Republican causes. She did run for the state Senate in a special election and failed to win the nomination. So this is sort of out of her comfort zone, trying to get on the big stage, running for public office. Peter Lamage of Fairfield is an immigrant from Albania. That's very much a part of the story he tells about his family escaping a communist regime. Like Leora, he is conservative. He is supportive of Donald Trump, and he also is opposed to abortion, as is Leora Levy. Peter Lamage was the nominee for Secretary of State a couple cycles ago. He ran for governor last time unsuccessfully. He did not make it to the primary.
When we think about the way that our state is made up in terms of Republicans, when we think about Themis's, as you mentioned, she being a social moderate, and then these other two candidates who are more conservative, would that play better for Republicans, maybe for parts of the 5th district or over in the 2nd district? Mark, what do you think?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. So there were any number of delegates I spoke to over the weekend who were very pragmatic, people who described themselves as conservatives, but viewed Themis Claridis as the most electable of the bunch, not just because of her political positions, but because of her skills as a campaigner. That she has been the spokesperson for the party in legislative debates. She is very comfortable mixing it up. As Themis would put it, she's very comfortable punching it up. She enjoys sharp debates. She does not shy away from conflict. So she had that certain appeal. The flip side is, and this is the debate you hear over and over again: are the Republicans better off with somebody who can appeal to the broader swath of unaffiliateds on issues like abortion? Or are you better off offering a sharp contrast to Dick Blumenthal, who obviously is a liberal Democrat, who strong supporter of gun control, abortion rights? Abortion will be an issue we hear over and over again this summer and fall, thanks to what's going on at the Supreme Court. So those are the two differing schools of thought. But I think the delegates, 56% of the delegates decided that Themis Claridis was the way to go, that if they are going to take advantage of what appears to be a decent atmosphere for Republicans, given the unpopularity of Joe Biden and the general trend in midterms of the party out of power at the White House, picking up seats. But again, in blue Connecticut, there will be the 5th district, congressional district, is probably the most competitive. Other than that, this still remains a solid blue state in most congressional contests for sure.
And so what happens behind the scenes? So again, Themis Claridis got the endorsement. You've got Lumage and Levy who are qualified for the primary. Do you expect there to be a 3-way primary for this particular race in August? Or will there be some behind the scenes conversations happening?
Peter Lumage says he's absolutely committed to going forward. Leora Levy left after the vote, but she indicated she would go forward. Both Lumage and Levy went to that convention knowing Themis Claridis was going to win the endorsement. So it wasn't like that was a surprise that might discourage them. So the expectation is, yes, there'll be a 3-way primary unless one of them suddenly wakes up and says, nah, I want to go to the Cape for the summer instead of spending it tromping around Connecticut.
When we think about the incumbent, Senator Richard Blumenthal, again, name recognition, and we think about his campaign coffers. I mean, what do you expect to hear from him? Is it going to be after the primary that the campaign may be heating up more?
Excuse me? Dick Blumenthal campaigns year-round. When it's an election year or not. I don't think you will see anything different from Senator Blumenthal as we see at any other year in any other month. He is constant. He is in constant campaign mode. He is a creature of outreach. He always has been when he was Attorney General and certainly in the United States Senate. So, I think people of Connecticut will see the Dick Blumenthal that they've known for years, and they'll either go again with him or they won't. But I don't think you're going to see any change whatsoever in his positions, in his personality, or in his habits.
But given what you just said, does that work against him in terms of people maybe getting tired of this longtime politician in this particular seat?
Well, you've touched on the intangible, the hardest to measure thing in politics, which is, when does a politician get to that tipping point? When do they stay too long at the fair? And we saw a little bit of that in 2006 when Chris Murphy beat Nancy Johnson for Congress in the 5th district. Blumenthal's approval ratings, the internals that the various parties have, I'm told they're not as good as there's been in the past, but that does not mean he is in grave danger. But you've hit on something, which is you just don't know. At what point will the voters look at somebody and say, "Yeah, it's time for a change"? In Connecticut, the thing that will help him, though, is there's been a fairly strong history of Connecticut voters not feeling comfortable with the Republican message nationally. Republicans in Connecticut compete quite well for governor until the election of Donald Trump in 2016, which energized really a new generation of Democratic voters. They were competitive in the General Assembly. You know, they won half the seats in the state Senate, and they came pretty darn close in the House. So you do have this dichotomy in Connecticut of Republicans really having difficulty in congressional races, in part because a lot of voters who may be inclined to go for a Republican they know here perhaps are not crazy about putting Mitch McConnell back in charge of the United States Senate.
You're hearing Mark Pazniokas here on Where We Live as we talk about the state Republican and Democratic conventions that just wrapped up. We spent a lot of time talking about the Senate race, a lot of more interesting races to talk with Mark about. And as I mentioned, he's Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Before we get to the other state offices, because I mentioned the congressional races, so the fifth you anticipate being the most competitive?
Yes, although George Logan, the Republican, his fundraising was pretty unimpressive the last quarter. So I don't know what's going on there, if the enthusiasm is there. But yes, on paper, certainly, the 5th District is the one that is most competitive, even though Republicans have not won that seat since the 2004 election. You do see Republicans for other offices, statewide offices, who have carried that district. So that certainly tells you that the voters in the 5th District are open to voting for a Republican. It's just a question of, will George Logan, a former state senator, grab their attention away from Johanna Hayes?
The state treasurer and secretary of the state races, those are also interesting at the conventions on both sides. Let's talk about the secretary of the state's race first, starting with the Republican convention. Also a primary expected?
Yes. And now we're getting into the area of inside baseball, right? Let's be honest. There is rarely a race for secretary of the state or treasurer that's going to excite more than the insiders. But the office of Secretary of State is an open race because Denise Merrill is not running again. So that tends to excite people who have their ambitions. So on the Republican side, you have a state representative, Terry Wood, who came in 3rd at their convention, although arguably she may be the most electable, a woman from Fairfield County who is really in step with a lot of Democrats about opening up the process. The other two, the man who won is Dominic Rapini, who is tried to make a name for himself talking about voter fraud, and then Brock Weber, who works for Aaron Stewart, the mayor of New Britain. And the race for Secretary of State on the Republican side, it has sort of overtones of the hangover from the 2020 presidential, which is what was the role of voter fraud? Now, all 3 Republicans, even Mr. Rapini and Mr. Weber, who are more open to talking about the dangers of voter fraud, they acknowledge the legitimacy of Joe Biden's election as president. So they are trying to, I think, not be deemed as super duper Trumpers in a way that even discomforts a lot of Republicans at this point, who are ready to move on and say, look, voter fraud does exist, but there's absolutely no evidence that it is scalable and can tilt a presidential election, one that would have required flipping, a half dozen states. On the Democratic side, it's a different dynamic. We're getting into identity politics. The Democrats, since 1962, have run tickets that have had a degree of diversity. There's been a Black candidate for treasurer every cycle. This year, there was a curveball thrown by Sean Wooden, the treasurer. He dropped out fairly late in the game. So there was a quick scramble. Eric Russell, who had been vice chair of the state party, he won the endorsement. He was certainly helped by the short runway for that race and the fact that he knows a lot of the folks who were delegates. And then you had Dita Bhargava of Greenwich, and we will get into race and ethnicity because that is going to be a relevant part of this election. Eric Russell is Black. Dita Bhargava is an Indian American. She ran against Sean Wooden in a primary last time. She is a creature of Wall Street. She says she's the most qualified. Eric Russell is a bond attorney. His background is similar to that of Sean Wooden's, the current treasurer. Then you have Karen Du Bois Walton, who's an African-American woman from New Haven. There was a great desire in some circles to have a Black woman run, believing that it's a good way to turn out Black women voters who are an important part of the Democratic coalition. Karen Du Bois Walton she runs the New Haven Housing Authority. She is also the chair of the State Board of Education, a position that she got from Governor Lamont.
So that was for state treasurer. In terms of secretary of the state, 5 candidates vying for that endorsement. Representative Stephanie Thomas getting the endorsement. Tell us about her. She's fairly new to politics or to even name recognition in our state.
Yes, that was a bit of a surprise. She is a first-term state representative from Norwalk, although she is vice chair of the Government Administration Elections Committee, which is the committee that really deals with election rules and laws. So she is certainly conversant in the issues that these folks will be talking about in the primary. And again, let's just get to it on racial and ethnic identity. Stephanie Thomas is Black. There was a desire in that race. Can the Democrats finally put Latina on the ticket? There's never been anybody identified as Hispanic or Latino on the statewide ticket for the Democrats. And there are 2 who competed with her, 2 Latinas, Representative Hilda Santiago of Meriden and Maritza Bond of New Haven, who is really their public health director. And then you had 2 white males, Josh Elliott, state rep from Hamden, who did not get the 15% at the convention that automatically qualifies you for primary. Matt Lesser, the state senator from Middletown, did. He has probably the highest profile in Democratic circles. He had some labor backing. It's unclear whether he will go forward. He has to make a decision today, and I'm told he's calling town chairs in his district. The convention for state senate in his district is tonight. So he needs to make a decision today. Is he going forward with a primary for Secretary of State, or will he fall back and seek re-election to the state senate? Hilda Santiago has a similar decision to make. She has a little bit more time, but does she want to return to the House where she's a deputy speaker, or take one last gamble in her career for statewide office?
And what about Ms. Bond, I believe, who's the health director in New Haven? Is she potentially still interested?
She. I'm told that she is definitely running. I did not reach her yesterday, but somebody in her campaign told me the intention is to go forward. And again, Maritza Bond went to the convention not expecting to leave with the endorsement, so it's not like that was a shock to her. But it's interesting. Maritza Bond and Stephanie Thomas, I'm told, are actually quite friendly. They've got to know each other. So that will be an interesting little contest to watch. I don't think you're going to see those two women cut each other up in the way that I believe we will see in the Republican primary for the United States Senate. I think that one's going to get pretty nasty pretty quickly.
And moving on to the most exciting race, in quotes, the governor's race. No surprises. No surprises at the Republican convention, the Bob Stefanowski.
None whatsoever. And so Ned Lamont and Bob Stefanowski made clear that they live in different political universes. Friday night at the Republican convention, the issue of abortion does not exist. It will not be mentioned. All that will be mentioned is our fiscal issues and the question of parental involvement in the schools, which, the question is, well, is that a dog whistle for some deeper things? I mean, how will he develop that? That was a big applause line. And the question is, when people applaud that line, that parents should have greater control, what are they talking about? Is that a reflection on critical race theory, or which really isn't taught in the schools, but the question of the influence of critical race theory on how children are taught about issues of race and the history of slavery? Is it a reflection of the fact that some schools are more open to teaching children about the diversity, about gender identity? At what age? Is that appropriate? How do you teach it? There is a super PAC that was formed recently, backed by a wealthy hedge fund guy in Stanford. And he says he's going to spend $1 million making critical race theory, the fact that transgender athletes can compete in girls' schools, and then how issues of sexuality and gender are taught in the schools. These are not topics, I think, that Ned Lamont and Bob Stefanowski are really eager to directly engage, but they're going to be out there. And same thing with abortion. Abortion is now an issue that was long settled in Connecticut, but if the Supreme Courts throw it back to the states, as the court seems inclined to do, it will no longer be an issue that candidates for governor can ignore and simply say it's settled law. The governor today is doing a ceremonial bill signing of a law that really brands Connecticut as a safe harbor for women seeking abortion. Bob Stefanowski's running mate, Laura Devlin, voted for that bill. Bob Stefanowski has yet to tell us if he would have voted for it, or if he was governor, would he sign it? So, we will be pursuing Mr. Stefanowski to sort of see where he is on that. I think he was a little reluctant to really wade into the debate over abortion before the convention. Now that it's over, we'll see where he goes on that.
Well, thanks for all of the context you provided. Mark, did we miss anything?
Nah.
We'll have you back soon, I'm sure. Mark Pazniokas, Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure. And if I forgot anything, Julia Bergman can catch up on you.
We'll definitely ask her. Julia Bergman with Hearst coming up later on the show as we pivot to cannabis. As we know, Connecticut's cannabis industry for adult use is moving along. The first applicants for retail licenses will be drawn soon through a lottery system. The catch? Just 12 are available, 12 licenses, and more than 15,000 applications have come in. We'll talk to the Deputy Commissioner of the State Department of Consumer Protection after the break. What questions do you have? You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. A milestone is expected soon in Connecticut's recreational cannabis market. The state is expected to select its first retail licenses by lottery, but there are thousands of applicants for just a dozen licenses in this first round. Coming up, we're going to hear from Hearst Connecticut's Julia Bergman about the latest in the cannabis industry developments in our state. First, joining us is Andrea Comer, Deputy Commissioner of the State Department of Consumer Protection. She also chairs the Social Equity Council. Andrea, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Lucy. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I mentioned the first round retail licenses up first. 12 are available, and you guys have received more than 15,000 applications. Was that surprising?
It actually was. We had heard the struggles that other states have had, particularly in terms of getting social equity applications. And so we were, it's one of those glass half full or half empty, depending upon how you look at it. On the one hand, we have robust applications. On the other hand, the question is, will there be dominance among certain applicants in terms of the number of applications they submitted?
Now, you mentioned other states and then just what you mentioned, applications they submitted. So there was a loophole, I understand, where people could put in more than one application because of the lottery system. Can you tell us more?
Sure. So I believe it's Section 40 of the statute that says that they can have no more than 2 licenses at the time that the lottery is run. Fortunately, that means they can apply for as many licenses as they prefer. So, it's one of those nuanced language situations that created this sort of Pandora's box, if you will.
So applicants applying for this retail license, you're getting a lot of duplicate applications?
We have seen several applications from, I think it's probably between 15 and 20 applicants submitting several applications for the lottery. That said, the chances are about 1 in 10 of getting one of the licenses for those who have submitted, hundreds of applications. So we are still hopeful that there will be diversity in terms of the number of licenses awarded.
We know there are many out-of-state companies that already have a footprint here in our state because of medical marijuana, and so it'll be interesting to see the out-of-state operators who maybe are backing some of these local applicants. Andrea, as you mentioned, social equity has been a priority in the state, but in terms of how it's all going to flesh out, what are your big concerns here?
I think the largest concern, again, is just having diversity of applications. I mean, if one person, let's say, gets 2 or 3 licenses with the backing of a multi-state operator, if they're still committed to community reinvestment in terms of hiring folks from their communities, in terms of, really trying to leave a positive footprint in the communities where they are established, then I don't think it's a bad thing. I certainly understand the concerns that folks have in terms of multi-state operators dominating the market. But the truth of the matter is, no state has been able to get this perfect. I've looked around for best practices. There really are none. I've looked for promising practices, and those are kind of few and far between. So we are committed to rolling this out as equitably as possible. But the legislation is what it is. And so we are confined by the parameters of that law.
Again, you're hearing Andrea Comer, who's Deputy Commissioner of the State Department of Consumer Protection. She also chairs the Social Equity Council. So break it down further for us, for listeners who are not as knowledgeable about this as you and your team, in terms of 12 retail licenses. Half of them need to go to social equity applicants. And so walk us through this process of how they'll be chosen.
Sure. So once the application period has closed, which it closed last week, there will be 2 lotteries. Each license type will have 2 lotteries, one for social equity and one for the general lottery. Social equity will go first. those who are not selected for the social equity lottery and those who were selected but did not meet the social equity criteria, they will have to pay the full fee and then be entered into the general lottery. Each applicant will receive a unique identification number, and those numbers will go to the third party lottery operator. The third party will then randomize and rank the application numbers, inform DCP which numbers were selected. In terms of the social equity applicants, the SEC will review those selected applicants to ensure they meet the social equity criteria. And then those applicants who are selected for both groups will be notified.
Mm. When we talk about this first lottery, again, a third party reviewing the non-social equity applicants, your council reviewing the equity applicants. This is just one big step of many when we think about the type of capital that people need to start their businesses. So what's happening on that front?
Sure. So the Social Equity Council approved an RFP to be posted, which was posted last week, for an accelerator, which will help those social equity applicants who need technical assistance, need access to capital assistance. We've had several conversations with various entities that provide financing in one way or another. Until this is federally legal, the access to capital challenge will remain. You cannot walk into one of the larger banks and acquire a loan because it is not federally legal. That said, there are a few institutions in the state, and there are some national, that are dedicated to supporting cannabis entrepreneurs in terms of capital.
And when we talk about social equity applicants, just to reiterate, people who've been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, what are you hearing from these applicants? Again, you have monthly meetings, there's public comment. Are they frustrated with this process, Andrea?
Yes, I think they are frustrated, and I certainly understand that frustration. There are some who feel like there should not be a lottery. There are some who feel as though there should not be lottery fees. There are others who are very frustrated by that loophole that we talked about that allows one applicant to submit several applications. But again, the legislation was written as it was. The Social Equity Council nor DCP have the authority or ability to make changes to that law. That will have to come through legislative change. And as this process rolls out, we will be, sort of documenting some of these challenges and obstacles, and making recommendations to the legislature for the next session. I recognize that is not, that doesn't course correct for this round. But, this is a process that's going to require course correction as we go.
And when you talk about the ability of lawmakers to address these loopholes, these concerns, that could potentially happen before the second round, I believe, this fall when more licenses are given out, Andrea?
That would only happen if they decided to convene in special session. Otherwise, we would have to wait until the next legislative session in 2023.
I see. And so when we think about when this all will roll out in terms of when the lawmakers at the General Assembly pass this law to permit recreational cannabis, I think the hope was that things would be up and running by the end of 2022. Not so much now, or probably next year, as you're saying.
No, I think the retail sales are still on track to launch at the end of the year. I think it's just in terms of what subsequent rounds look like is going to be determined by any changes that the legislature may make. But I think we're still on track to have doors open by the end of the year.
Okay, that's good to know. And when we think about how there's so many moving parts, so this is just the first lottery for retail licenses. Next up would be micro cultivators. Can you explain more, Andrea?
Sure. So a micro cultivator is a grower just in a smaller square feet of space than a cultivator, which I think is up to 15,000. Cultivator is about 2,500. The lottery fee for that is 125. The application process is now open. It opened on February 10th, and then it'll close tomorrow, actually at 11:59. And so the same lottery process will apply for all of the license types.
At the top of the show, I said the lottery for the first retail licenses will be happening soon. When, Andrea?
I can only say the end of the year in terms of when retail sales start. It's hard to pinpoint an exact date.
So the lottery will be happening soon, but then the applicants will be reviewed. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct. So for those social equity applicants, the Social Equity Council is contracted with an accounting firm. They will be doing a cursory review of those applications to ensure that social equity applicants meet the criteria, which is no more than 300% of the state's median household income or residency in a disproportionately impacted area for 5 of the last 10 years or 9 of the 18 years from birth to 18.
When we think about out-of-state operators and what impact they'll have on this new industry in our state, I'm also thinking about some of the reporting that the Hartford Business Journal has done, looking at hemp farmers in our state who also feel like, maybe it would have been a better way to give them access to this industry because they're already growing hemp. Have you been hearing from them? And is there any movement to get a particular hybrid license? I understand medical cannabis growers can apply for hybrid, but not hemp farmers.
Yes, that's correct. There was no provision allowing for hybrid in the legislation. However, House Bill 5329, which was passed, does establish the creation of a study to just sort of explore that. I know New York has recently allowed for hemp farmers to enter the recreational cannabis industry. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, as well as what the study reveals.
This all sounds so complicated, Andrea. You and your team bending the ear of lawmakers who passed this law and then left the work to be done with DCP. What else do you want our listeners to know about this process moving forward?
I think most importantly, I want listeners and those who are interested in this space to know that the Social Equity Council is committed to promoting equity in whatever way possible. I want them to know that we are playing the hand that we were dealt in terms of the legislation, but we are, nothing is set in stone, and we hope that as we identify challenges that we'll be able to address them through the legislation. I also want folks to know that there are sort of 3 prongs to this legislation. One is around decriminalization of cannabis. The second one, obviously, is the opening of the cannabis industry. But the third part is about community reinvestment. And I think sometimes because that is seen as sort of a down the road objective, people lose sight of that. So while this process may have its challenges, the fees that are coming in are going to be reinvested in those communities. And I want those disproportionately impacted areas and the leaders, community leaders, elected leaders to be thinking about, what are the ways in which we can use this revenue to really kind of restore those communities that have been so negatively impacted. Is it, job training opportunities? Is it support for entrepreneurs who want to get into an industry other than cannabis? Is it around substance abuse education? Is it youth programs? We really want for the revenue that comes into this, and I know the legislature and the governor really thought critically about this. How can those communities be improved through this new industry?
That's Andrea Comer, Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Consumer Protection, also Chair of the Social Equity Council. Thank you for updating us on where this process stands. I'm sure we'll be having more conversations in the next few months with you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lucy.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up, we're going to continue talking about Connecticut's recreational cannabis industry. We're going to hear from Hearst, Connecticut state politics reporter Julia Bergman. What questions do you have? You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're talking about Connecticut's cannabis industry, adult use, with the first retail licenses expected to be selected by the state soon. Joining us now on Zoom, Julia Bergman, state politics reporter at Hearst, Connecticut. Julia, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Lucy.
So what stands out to you in this first round for retail licenses, from what you heard from Andrea, but also at the reporting that you and your team have done?
Yeah, so I think you'll find that a lot of legalization advocates have said how important it is, just how important it is in the early rounds to make sure there's equitable outcomes. You know, who gets those initial licenses is really important for establishing, you know, the market in a state that's just starting to legalize cannabis. So I think that's definitely something that sticks out. You know, as was mentioned, the odds are pretty long for somebody to get one of these coveted licenses. You had over 15,000 applications for just 12 licenses. So I think the sort of first major test of equity will be, you know, who gets those licenses to begin with.
And what are you hearing from social equity applicants about the process, Julia?
I mean, I think there's some criticism of the way in which Connecticut's lottery system was designed. As was mentioned, you can submit any number of applications that you'd like. So while there is a cap on the number of licenses that can be issued, you know, allowing somebody who has the means to buy, you know, multiple applications or pay for multiple applications fees, that was a way to sort of give a leg up to maybe people with more means or out-of-state companies. So that's, you know, sort of a major, I think, issue as Connecticut looks into, you know, sets up this market.
When we talk about multi-state operators, you know, who are we talking about here? Again, I had referenced to Andrea, there are several that are already involved in the medical marijuana program in Connecticut. And so can you tell us more?
Yeah, I think you have the current 4 medical producers in Connecticut are owned by out-of-state companies. These are companies that, you know, are involved in cannabis businesses in a number of states across the country. Curaleaf is one name that sticks out. So entities like that, sort of larger corporations, which I think those involved in crafting Connecticut's law or who were really concerned about ensuring that Connecticut's law really factored in equity, you know, those are kind of the entities, the companies that they were worried about coming in and taking over Connecticut's recreational market.
When we heard Andrea mention the duplicate applications, I'm wondering if you can tell us more. I understand you were talking with someone who actually is a consultant that helps these businesses interested in getting into markets like Connecticut. So what can you tell us?
Yeah, a consultant based in Chicago that has a company there that helps people and entities get involved into the cannabis market in various states, you know, helps them with the application process. Had mentioned that he had clients that were considering submitting hundreds of applications each, and in some cases these were duplicate applications for the same license type to increase their chances of getting picked in the state red lottery. And I think that's a trend you've also seen in other states as well. And at the same time, this is all going on, I think it's worth pointing out that Connecticut cities and towns are establishing their own rules for whether they want to allow these businesses, cannabis businesses, you know, within their borders and where. And you've seen a lot of cities and towns, at least initially, opt out of having these businesses within their borders.
When we think about some of these multi-state operators who might be teaming up with a social equity applicant, Julia, what do you think in terms of, helping certain locals get into the business, but having that extra boost from people who know what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that you're going to need a lot of capital no matter what to start up in this industry. You need a lot of money up front, and the application fees are only one step in the process, and you have tens of thousands of dollars for provisional licenses and final licenses, and then you have, of course, the cost of doing businesses. So having financial backing and strong financial backing is obviously incredibly important. But obviously there's a concern about, where that money is coming from.
When we talk about where the money is coming from, I understand there was some movement at the latest Social Equity Council meeting when we think about who's backing some of these social equity applicants.
Yeah, so initially the Social Equity Council had established a requirement that backers had to show 3 years worth of tax returns. And at their latest meeting, they actually did away with that requirement. There wasn't a lot of debate around, why they did so. But I think there was a recognition that was sort of logistically, not going to work out in the way that they wanted. I think obviously the intended goal was to sort of, understand sort of the finances behind who was getting involved or, where the money was coming from. But I think it was determined that this was not the best way to tackle that.
And it was interesting to hear Andrea mention, the loophole, the duplicate applications, but also just as they're seeing the process roll out, lawmakers will, need to revisit this, but potentially not going to happen until 2023.
Right. You had lawmakers make some changes this legislative session to tighten up what they saw was a gray area of the law around cannabis gifting, which is allowed under the law. But there was some larger scale events where cannabis gifting was occurring, and lawmakers didn't like that wasn't being regulated. So while you will still be allowed to gift your friends, a bag of marijuana, for example, it won't be allowed on such a large scale. And they've established some fines for violating that. And they also tightened up some restrictions around billboard advertising around cannabis. But there are definitely more changes that people want to make to the law, but those will have to wait until the next legislative session.
We've been having these conversations every few months just to keep listeners abreast of this process moving forward, this recreational cannabis industry. Obviously, a lot of money involved and money that the state will be also making. But do we have any idea, when we think about the number of Connecticut residents who, are looking forward to this, or the number that actually go across the border now to Mass while they wait to see how the industry picks up here, Julia?
So we've asked Massachusetts for their numbers as far as out-of-state residents coming there, and they say they don't keep track of those numbers. I mean, we have some sense based on the number of registered medical patients in Connecticut, which is over 50,000, I believe. Can give you some sense of, consumers here in Connecticut. The state of Washington actually contracted with a consultant to do a survey to kind of look at consumption. I'm not sure if that's something that Connecticut might consider doing as well to sort of determine based on age. This will be available to people 21 and older, some type of survey of applicants. But I'm sure there will be, high interest, certainly, as there has been in other states.
That's Julia Bergman, state politics reporter at Hearst, Connecticut. So the question is, when exactly is this lottery taking place? We weren't able to get that from Andrea, but I'm sure we'll be following the reporting of you and your team, Julia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lucy.
That's Julia Bergman, state politics reporter at Hearst, Connecticut. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. You can listen to Where We Live anytime. Just download the show on your favorite podcast app. Back tomorrow.